All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to invite you to the 2022 Psychi webinar series. If I could ask everybody first off to please mute yourself. So I am Cynthia Wilson. I'm the Director of Membership and Development with Psychi. And I'd like to present to you our presenter today, Dr. Rodney L. Lohman. He is a consulting psychologist and author. He is president of Lohman and Richardson Consulting Psychologists. He's Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the California School of Professional Psychology, Alliant International University in San Diego, California. Dr. Lohman is widely recognized authority on professional ethics and on career assessment and interventions, and he has consulted with a number of career and organizational clients. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Lohman, for being with us today, and I will hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. Here in California, it's around 12:30 in the afternoon, and I know that we have people from all over the country and probably some from other countries as well. So good day to you wherever you may be joining us from. Our topic today is one that I've been involved with for much of my career, and that is why your interest, your ability, and personality matter for career success. Okay, so I'm going to make some suggestions as we go forth, and I'm going to try to provide you some information about what I think is important in choosing and sustaining your career over time. And because this is a group of folks who are psychologists or who are in training to become psychologists, I'm going to share with you some of the details about why I think each of these things are important. Now, Psychi has played a role in my professional life. I went to graduate school at Michigan State University and studied and trained in the industrial, organizational, and clinical psychology program. And it was my pleasure when I was there to serve as the president of the graduate chapter of Psychi. And when many years later I mentioned that to one of the leaders in Psychi, they mentioned that they have records going back till then and sent me a copy of the little sign-up card I had done, which was interesting to see. So I am going to suggest to you that work matters, and it matters both for you and for your clients. And those of you who are in training to become mental health professionals, I would suggest work is often underrepresented in what people study and learn. Now, in today's presentation, we're going to focus on three particularly important domains or areas that are important in career choice and change. And these are occupational interest, abilities, and personality. Those are things about you or about the person that might be receiving counseling or assessment. But we need to know that why these things are so important is because we can characterize work, jobs, careers on these same dimensions, and fit does matter. We are likely to be more successful in our work and our careers when we have a good fit between our characteristics and those of the career or job. Now, all of this, we're going to cover just some highlights in our time today. My latest book is called Career Assessment, Integrating Interest, Ability, and Personality. It's a fairly thick book that took a number of years to finally get through, and it is published by the American Psychological Association. They provided me a discount code if you order, if you are interested and you order the book through APA Books. The code APA21 will should get you a discount on that. Now, I'm just going to briefly cover this slide, but I'll tell you a little bit about my own personal background. I started out with a degree in business. when and then went into the military at a time when people had to do that. And I went back when I got out. I'd been in the field of hospital administration. And when I got out, I got a second bachelor's degree in psychology. And then I went to graduate school and got my master's and PhD there. I did training in both IO psychology with some of the luminaries in the profession who were there at that time, and also in clinical psychology as well. Did an internship in Houston and did postdoctoral training after that. While I was in the military, I was essentially an administrator, and then subsequently my career has mirrored both the administrative and leadership roles as well as those as a scientist and researcher, an academic, and a practitioner. So I've had these various posts, including in academic administration, and always had teaching and writing, no matter what else I was doing, as an important part, which is my way of saying that this work applies to me as much as to anybody else. And so that's one of the reasons we sometimes study things, because they have personal importance to us. Now, I want to also suggest to you, especially for those who are in training or already in counseling or clinical roles, but it's also relevant for organizational folks and those in HR and so forth as well. Work matters. It matters because it affects most aspects of our lives. And I'm going to suggest to you that work can prevent and alleviate mental health problems, giving us a sense of self-esteem, self-efficacy, being more satisfied, and help us be better adjusted. And conversely, work can also cause mental health problems. Well, how is that that mental health problems can be caused by work? Well, consider the case of post-traumatic stress of people who went into the military perfectly well adjusted and came back after serious trauma and exposure to trauma with a chronic mental health condition. Consider also people who are subject to bullying and abuse at work. Consider people who develop depression and anxiety because their work does not fit them well, and they find it difficult to do, but they don't know quite what to do to make it better. So I'm suggesting to you work is very important. Now, the basic premise here is that we will be happier and more successful in our careers when our work is well suited to our personal characteristics. And we're going to be talking about several of those soon. Now, ask yourself this question: why did you want to become a psychologist? What is it about you that made that career attractive to you? And if you think about other people, with which psychologists and psychology graduate students and others tend to be prone to do, why did others choose the careers that they did? How can we help others better understand themselves so that they can make better career choices? And what are the major characteristics of people, the individual difference variables that cause you to make the choices that you make, and what happens when you make those choices in a way that doesn't work very well? Now, as psychologists, science, research, knowledge guide us in this work. And so there are literature, studies rather, that will help us understand what influences people use when they decide on their careers, what variables matter for career choice and change, how we can increase the likelihood of having a good fit for their career, and what happens when we can't make a good match because of things having to do with the environment more than having to do with us. And finally, I want to differentiate right now between nomothetic and idiographic approaches. You've probably heard those terms before. In nomothetic, which a lot of psychology is all about, we are looking at group level characteristics. But when you're doing career counseling or you're counseling yourself about your career, that is an idiographic approach. That is, we are looking at an individual who may fit the group characteristic in some ways and not in others. And so we're really working, when we do this kind of work with others, we're working typically at the individual level, but we're building on what we know about from the from the group level. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that organizations and careers are not random collections of individuals. This is what I call the invisible hand hypothesis from economics applied to career and work choices. That is to say, or college majors, that something is there that draws us to particular kinds of work. And I'm going to further suggest that for most people, the process works pretty effectively in drawing us to college majors, trade schools, occupations that are reasonably good fits to us. It is those for whom that process has not worked that we are often working with in our roles as psychologists. And it also suggests that organizations and areas of study, like why some people go into psychology and some go into engineering, that they have many aspects that people within them tend to have in common. And so the most popular major in many colleges and universities in the first 2 years is undecided. And how is it that people make that decision? Well, for many of us, that decision is made by going to different classes. And at probably an unconscious level, we are asking ourselves, do we fit in here? Do we like these people? Do we like our professors? Do we like the content? And then in such a successive approximation approach, we gradually come to see, well, what really works for me? Equally important is what does not work for me? What can I not do? What do I not want to do? Now, we're going to talk about 3 different domains, and clearly we're just briefly introducing them today. Interest, abilities, and personality. What I'm calling a domain is a major category of human characteristics, and there's several factors that I think are important here. I'd ask people to please mute themselves, or maybe we can do that overall so that we don't have noise coming in. One is, before we call something a domain, there has to be a literature that shows that this characteristic, like personality or abilities, relates to something important in life. That we can predict job performance, we can predict career satisfaction. Secondly, a domain is not just a single variable, it is something that encompasses multiple variables within it. It is also needs to be separable from other categories. So interest, abilities, and personality overlap, but they don't overlap in other important ways. We're also talking today, in these 3 domains, we're talking about things that are relatively stable over time. That is, interests, for example, are among the most stable of any individual difference variable in psychology. And if we measure people after their interests stabilize or crystallize and become predictable in their late teens to early 20s, those same dimensions, those same code of vocational interest is likely to be found later on. We also hope that our domains of interest are not culturally specific. And in these cases, these interests, abilities, and personalities are found with similar structure throughout the world and in many subcultures as well. Now, I've mentioned this several times, but here's a visual way of looking at it. We're going to talk about 3 different domains, each one at a time as if the other two didn't exist, but we recognize that they do exist. And that's part of what individuals need to do, is figure out, okay, I've got this, this, and this. How do I put them together? So they're related, they overlap slightly, as the Venn diagram suggests, but they also have independent variants. So let's talk about interests. What are interests? Now, interests have to do with what you want to do, not whether you're good at it, not whether you'll be good at it, but whether you are likely to find the activities, the things that are done in those areas to be interesting, engaging, things that you want to spend more time doing. There's something called the Gallup 12, which is a 12-item survey that the Gallup Corporation, which is known for their political polls, but their main business is doing business consulting, finds important in predicting people's satisfaction and happiness within their workplaces. One of those 12 items is, I'm paraphrasing this for our purposes today, does my occupation and career give me the opportunity most of the time daily to do what I love doing and do best? Now, the actual item is, does my job give me, in this case, so we're talking about careers and occupational choice. Ask yourself that question about your own work. Does it give you the opportunity most of the time? Everybody's has bad days, and there are days you wish you weren't in this career, but most of the time daily to do what I love doing and do best. We're going to talk about do best under abilities. Here we're talking about love doing. Now, what attracts you, what sustains your attention, and these factors within interest are very well established and have been for a long time. They do predict well to career choices. They're very stable. They have a variety of measuring devices out there. They have cross-cultural validity. They are associated with some sex differences in interest at the group level, but those seem to correspond with real differences. Now, the guru in this field, the late John Holland, his last book-length treatment about interest was Making Vocational Choices, and I'm sure you'll find it in your university libraries if you're in school or professor, and it summarizes all of the literature that was done to the 90s. This has been an incredibly prolific area of research. And most of the models today have what I call the big six, and people refer to this as the RIASEC factors, and you may have heard of these before. And we're going to talk about each of these very briefly, a lot more detail in the book, but recognizing that each one of us is not a single interest. There are some people that maybe are just absolutely investigative and nothing else, but even they will have other interests, if not quite as strong. For most of us, we're looking at your top 3 scores. So as I go through this very brief introduction to these big 6 interest factors, I want you to ask yourself, does this sound like something that interests me? Does it sound like me? Does it sound like an environment where I'd like to be? And I argue, in doing this work for a long time, it is equally important to know what you're not as it is to know what you are. So when you hear about something, you say, yeah, I don't think so. Well, one of the questions would be, well, do you have enough information to have that reaction? But nonetheless, we want to know what we like, and we want to know what we dislike. So here's the first of the big 6, realistic, the world of things. Here you find, if you think about occupations as especially emphasizing work with data, with people or things, people in the realistic area have a natural comfort, a natural liking of working with things, objects, machines, equipment, as opposed to working with people or working conceptually. They tend to be practical, good with their hands in many occupations. A lot of the blue-collar occupations are within this area. But at the high end, we see occupations like engineer, airplane pilots, people who some aspects of science have a physical world type component as well. So here's some of the typical characteristics. Greater skills for this group in the mechanical world versus abstraction or the people side of things. There is a gender difference on realistic interest that has been shown time after time again, that men in general versus women in general tend to endorse slightly higher realistic interests, but having worked in a number of realistic dominated organizations, there are many realistic women, and they tend to have a lot of the same characteristics of interest, ability, and personality as do the men. Where would you go to look for realistic folks? Factories, the military, skilled trades, technical positions. All right, let's go on to the second one, investigative. This has to do with what I call the world of science. And here you see some examples of where scientists work in laboratories. A lot of folks in universities would have investigative interests. Researchers here in San Diego, we have a whole lot of scientists, the Salk Institute, number of major, very prominent universities, a lot of research entrepreneurial organizations that work in the biomedical sciences and so forth. So those are the kind of places where they would likely to be. Here we have folks who are more typically comfortable with ideas than with people, things. It depends on what it is that you're researching. Greater skills in the cognitive as a group than in the interpersonal world. Most investigative types who use these interests in their job tend to be compulsive, hardworking, have high standards of excellence. If you think about what it takes to be a scientist, these days you have to not only get a bachelor's degree, graduate degrees, typically at the doctoral level, but in many cases you also have to go to do postdoc work, and you may have several years of that. Fairly even balance between men and women, although women in the past were kept out of many investigative areas. As those barriers have been removed, we see much more evenness. And we talked about the kinds of places where you would find them. Now we come to one of the most challenging areas to have interest, and that is artistic. And I call this the world of creating. I think we could also call it the world of artistic expression. And here we would see visual artists, musicians, people in dance, writers, playwrights, and so forth. Now, most people with artistic interest tend to enjoy individualistic expression and creativity. They tend to dislike routine, except when you're doing it in service of a creative purpose. For example, if you are a musician and you make your living as a musician, chances are you're going to be practicing your instrument multiple hours a day. And if you stop doing that, you're probably going to have difficulty in performing. And so that, in a way, is routine, but is routine doing something that people love and that they want to be a central focus of their life. This is the bad news about artistic interest. How I frame it is that many are called and few are chosen. And if you think about what it takes to be a successful creative writer of fiction, the number of people, even in a wealthy country like the United States, who are able to make a living just from their creative writing is actually quite small. 330 million people approximately in the US. How many are actually creative writers. It follows also that in the many are called, few are chosen, that they're very high standards of excellence in their field. It's a lot easier in other fields to be an average performer and have a job and a career. In the artistic area, much more difficult. And so it follows that many people with artistic interest are going to be found working sometimes unhappily in other areas, and they have to find an outlet for their creative type interest. Where do you find these folks? Typically in working as freelancers, in musical venues, in creative organizations. I lived for a while in Los Angeles, and there's a slew of people working in restaurants who are trying to make it in the movies or make it in music and so forth. And many are not going to have a success with that. And so what happens to that side of them? Now, next is we move to the people-oriented areas. The social area involves the world of people. And here you see several types of occupations: teaching, medical service, counseling, helping people with disabilities, and so forth. Social people tend to have more comfort in working with people than with things or ideas. I suggest to you that they often take on the difficult jobs of society. There is a sex difference in this area in favor of women, again, on average, and not a huge difference, and they would tend to be found in the organizations shown there. Enterprising types are ones who like business and managing. I think a better name for it might be managerial rather than enterprising, because entrepreneurs have a little bit different profile than do managers in large corporations. Enterprising types help get things done. They focus on goal achievement, working with and through other people. Usually they like being in charge, having control. As a group, they can be competitive, sometimes argumentative. People who are managerial generally accept the system as it is, and they want to get ahead within that. They may make changes in it and so forth, but they're not saying, oh, I don't like any of that, I want to work on my own. You find these folks in for-profit businesses, government, politics, law, and startups. Now, lastly, of the big six, we have something called conventional. These are people who have great comfort working with data and great interest in detail. These are folks who are good at checking things, who are good at inputting things. They have more comfort with data than with people or ideas. When I was earlier in my career, we did a study when I was at University of Michigan involving one of the IRS service centers where you send your tax returns to every year in the United States. And I'm sure there's equivalent in other countries. And at the time, and until very recently, it was still done like this. Every tax return, the data on it was entered into the computer by two different data entry folks. And the computer would spit out any things that were discrepant so they could correct it. So if you imagine someone who would find it enjoyable and do well at entering data into the computer all day, where you're under strong demands for speed and accuracy, that then you have a good idea of what the conventional folks are like. Now, in fact, and briefly, the six interest codes actually have been studied greatly in terms of their underlying structure. And we do find many folks who've worked in this area, like Rounds and others, have demonstrated that there are two vectors, and some have argued for a third, but we'll stick with two for the moment. People versus things, which is anchored in on the realistic investigative side for things, and people on the enterprising social, and then another vector that deals with data versus ideas, and you can see how that is anchored. Now, there's some research that suggests there's a third vector, which is status, and some people are highly motivated by wanting to be in a high status career, and that can influence what kinds of careers they look at. Now, I want to introduce you, no matter where you are in the world, I want to introduce you to the ONET if you're not already familiar with it. First of all, they have an interest measure that you can find at the ONET online, and there is a place where you can take something called the interest profiler. Don't do it right now, but you can do it later if you've never taken that. And it will give you your scores on these 6 types. And then you can plug them in as shown here at this web address, and you can actually choose whatever your top 3 scores were, and you can find the occupations that are thought to be associated with those interests. It's an amazing service that is provided by the Department of Labor and other research-oriented folks, and it's pretty up to date, and you can get all kinds of wonderful information about careers you may be considering. Now, we want to move on now to the other 2 domains, and these are abilities and personality. So let's go to abilities next. Here we're talking about can do. The first domain was want to do, but I may want to be a brain surgeon, but I may not have abilities that go along with that. So maybe there are other kinds of occupations that match my ability profile. In this case, what are abilities? Abilities are, according to the ONET, enduring attributes of the individual that influence performance, or more simply, I call it can do. Now, there are 2 major kinds of abilities: general cognitive ability, and I differentiate between verbal and nonverbal, intelligence, in other words, and primary abilities, which are more circumscribed. Just to give you a flavor for this, we do find that general cognitive ability is represented differently. That is, you have higher and lower scores depending on what the occupations are. Generally, the greater the cognitive complexity of a career that it calls for, the higher the cognitive abilities will be. But notice also in this slide that there's a wide range within that. And if you're working with people that are in, for example, factories, blue-collar type work and so forth, people often underestimate what their intellectual abilities are because they tend to assess them relying on verbal rather than nonverbal measures, which do not speak to their strengths. Now, in the area of primary abilities, we don't have time today to go through each and every one of these, but to give you the feel for the overall list, these are things that we consider important in measuring somebody who is thinking about what they should do with their work lives. And why we think it is important to measure broadly on the ability side, not narrowly, is the task in career assessment, unlike in personnel selection, is to differentiate theoretically between this person and all possible jobs. So if we only measure cognitive ability, we don't measure mechanical or spatial, we may not be giving the person the best advice for their particular career choices. Physical abilities we rarely measure in career assessment because physical abilities don't generalize very well. There's a very large literature on physical abilities, and if you're working with a population where physical abilities are important, then you would need to consider incorporating measurement of that. But mechanical abilities have to do with the kind of things realistic people do well. They have to do with understanding of how machines operate and so forth. And measures of that tend to be highly visual with a limited amount of words. And you often find in working with people with realistic interests that they do well on mechanical abilities, oftentimes better than people with higher general cognitive ability, because we're measuring something that they probably are good at doing, and doing it in a way that doesn't have ways of measuring it as a problem to figuring out what they can do. So, thirdly, is a very important ability in certain types of occupations, particularly in realistic, investigative, and some of the artistic, and that is spatial ability. Spatial ability has to do with the ability to visualize shapes and objects, see how they can look from different angles. It's a kind of skill that is used by an architect, for example, in going from a two-dimensional drawing to a three-dimensional building. Aesthetic, musical, these relate especially to some of the artistic areas. We also want to look at inter and intrapersonal, the so-called social abilities or emotional intelligence that is sometimes called. On the management side, there's an array of abilities, like ability to influence other people and so forth, that can be looked at. And perceptual speed and accuracy and computational math are also relevant. And finally, creative abilities, which has to do not with seeing something as it is, but looking at as it might be. Now, we're going to move on now. Clearly, we're going through this quickly, and I see I wasn't a good checker in the spelling of personality, but okay. We're going to look now about work-related personality dimensions. This has to do with how to do. I don't think it is the case that, generally speaking, people should be choosing their occupations based on their personality. But if you otherwise have the relevant interest and the relevant abilities, then personality will help determine how you will go about doing it. So we talked about the big six in interest. Here we're talking about the big five, the so-called five-factor model: introversion, extroversion, conscientiousness, openness, neuroticism, adjustment, and agreeableness. We're only going to talk about the first four, and these have sometimes are important in understanding career choice, but it's more complex than you might think. Now, introversion, extroversion, everybody thinks they know what that means, but they really don't. Oftentimes people refer to introverted people as not liking people. That's not true. Not wanting to be around people. That's not quite true. They may have the same social interests, needs as more extroverted people, but after they have had exposure to other people, they often need a break from that, whereas extroverted people often are looking for more. Introversion, unfortunately, too often when we're talking about introversion, extroversion, we're talking about extroversion, and we need as much to talk about introversion. Neither is better than the other. They do have different advantages and disadvantages. Now, this is a definition. I'll let you look at that on your own, but it has to do with behavioral engagement with the external world. Extroverted people tend to like larger groups, tend to be seen as more outgoing, active, and more assertive. They are also seen as being people who seek their stimulation externally. Whereas in another model of introversion, extroversion, the basic underlying thing is not about whether you want to be around people all the time. It's your preference for stimulus seeking or avoiding. In this model, extroverts tend to be seen as stimulus deprived, so they are always seeking external stimulation to fill that. Whereas introverted people tend to be stimulus overloaded, and their job, in a way, is to keep stimulation out. And there is, in all of these variables we're talking about, there's probably a strong genetic component. Certainly that is true for interest and most of the personality variables as well. If you think about it for career purposes, while extroverts may be more often found in social-oriented careers, there's no reason why introverts who have a strong desire to work with people, to help people, and so forth, can't be equally effective. And in fact, the extroverts' need is often to talk less and listen more, and the introverts' need is to talk more so that they can not let other people manage their impressions. One of the most important books in this area was by Susan Cain, called Quiet: The Power of Introversion in a World That Can't Stop Talking. And it was sort of a real tour de force about introversion as opposed to about extroversion. Now, openness, and going through these briefly so we'll have time for questions. Here we're talking about flexibility, engagement with ideas, a preference for aesthetic versus pragmatic. There are differences in the interest types in terms of how likely they tend to be open. Managers as a group, for example, tend to score in the less open direction because their career involves getting things done, working with and through other people. And you can't just go off in new directions all the time if you're a manager. Conscientiousness, one of the best track records among personality variables. This is a preference for doing things as requested in a prescribed way, being reliable, dependable, orderly. It tends to speak to achievement orientation, but people who are low scorers may have a problem with reliability and the like, but they also may be artistic people who don't particularly want to be hemmed in by particular behavioral expectations. You can be too conscientious, the person who is rule-bound and nitpicky, and you can be too non-conscientious, the one who doesn't show up for work reliably and so forth. Emotional adjustment, we don't have time to talk about much today, but remember, we're talking in all these variables on the personality side. This is so-called normal personality. And so the name of the scale, I don't like the name, so I don't use it, but is neuroticism. I think a better name is emotional adjustment. And so folks who score low on emotional adjustment versus high tend to be ones, the literature suggests, of people who experience negative emotions, the high scorers in the neuroticism or less well-adjusted direction, and they may have a higher tendency to experience anxiety, distress, and depression. We know that in many of the artistic occupations, there is a tendency for folks to score in the less well-adjusted direction. And that partly goes with the nature of creativity and some other factors as well. But eminently creative folks, as were written about in this great book by Kay Redfield Jamison called Touched with Fire, where she reviews the relationship between creativity and affective disorder, in particular, depression and manic depressive disorder. And she provides a lot of evidence that eminently creative people have often been at high risk for experiencing psychological problems, particularly affective area. Here are some other areas that are important in career assessment: need for achievement, dominance, self-esteem and self-efficacy, even masculinity, femininity. And then finally, we want to focus on, and then we'll open it up for Q&A, how do you put all this together? Well, we can look at profiles. So if someone matches a particular career-related profile across all three domains, they are particularly likely, we argue, to be happy, satisfied, feel like they're a good fit for that profession. Nobody is a perfect fit for anything. You can be an extrovert and be a scientist, but you're going to be the exception. You can be an introvert and be a manager, but you're going to be the exception. But that doesn't mean you can't do it, especially if the other pieces are there. you're probably going to do a little bit differently than others do. I would say best single word descriptor in the investigative is scientific. Tend to be very bright. You have to be very smart, very conceptual, very good at working with ideas. Best abilities, that's a mistake there I need to fix. It's understanding ideas. That really is more, that's for the realistic, so just we'll fix that. Predominant affect, these are not typically the life of the party. People who are scientists tend to be rational, somewhat cautious, and they tend to be guided by logic, science, rational. They accept that there is a need as a scientist to constantly learn, and that the field is continually changing, just as it is in psychology. So they make a lifelong, profession-long commitment to keep up with the literature in their particular areas. Now, contrast that with an artistic profile. Here we have folks who are creative and expressive. Their average intelligence varies very much by what area they're pursuing. And you can think about to what extent, what kinds of abilities do you need to be effective in particular domains, like dance versus writing. Best abilities, we talked about that, vary by domain. These are people that tend to be very engaged with their emotions, and that oftentimes is something that is involved with their work. So an actor or actress, for example, they use themselves, their body, their feelings, to become, if they're good, to become another person, and think what it takes to be able to do that. So self-focus, when you use your body, every part of you, your gestures, etc., to become somebody else, you understand why that would be important. Now, social helpers tend to be high average or above, tend to be strong on social intelligence, tend to be optimistic and positive by nature. They like helping other people. They like being with other people. And they tend to be oftentimes more inductive and field dependent. Okay, well, we'll do the last one and then the last slide, and then we're going to open it up for your discussion. Managers as a group, they also tend to be bright, high average or above if they're working with any kind of complexity. But here we have something called managerial intelligence, the ability to work with others and other resources to get a job done, usually under time constraints and usually under resource constraints. Whereas social types tend to be very pleasant to deal with. Enterprising types are often fairly aggressive, fairly oriented to goal achievement, and their focus is less on people, even though they work with people, it's on getting the job done. They can be controlling, somewhat counter-dependent, and typically more oriented to rational and logical thinking. Now, for you, and if you ever get involved in doing this kind of work with others, how do we put this together? Well, one, I argue it is best to start with what people want to do. That's the interest side. What do I really like? Where am I going to get satisfaction from the doing? And then go to abilities, and finally go to personality. How will we go about doing that? In the end, though, we have to think about specific careers that will put our pieces together. And sometimes we may have can do and we don't have want to do. And so we can do the job, be effective at that. We just may not like it very much. And yes, that's fine to do if that's what life demands. If you have to do a job you don't particularly like, but ideally we want you to both be able to do the work and to like doing it, and to have figured out a way where you're going to be able also to use your personality as well. Okay, Cynthia, let's open it up to questions, comments, ideas, suggestions, whatever you'd like to talk about for our remaining time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Lohman. I'd like to invite everyone to put their questions in the chat and we'll monitor it that way. I'll repeat the question to Dr. Lohman and he can provide an answer. But I will say there have been a couple comments in the chat so far where Vanita in particular feels that they are a mix of different domains, perhaps. And I know that I felt this way when you were speaking. I wonder if you'd like to address that.
So by different domains is the idea that you would be one way in interest and a different way in abilities and a different way in personality, or within a domain that instead of being, you're not just extroverted, you're more in the middle.
Right. Well, she says, I think I am investigative and social mostly. I'm not artistic per se, but I'm creative and innovative.
Yeah. So let me say a couple things about that, because that's a great question to raise some issues. One is, it is possible to be creative in any occupation, and it is also possible not to be very creative in a so-called creative occupation. So you don't have to have artistic talent to be creative. We have creative engineers, we have creative managers and so forth. But a lot of folks in the artistic interest area do tend to be creative. Think about the difference between a musician who plays somebody else's work and someone who creates the work in the first place. The ideas about creativity are more likely to be in that composer than the other. And so remember what I said about interest. We don't look at you as one type. We want to look at your top three, and some, at least, sometimes four, sometimes less, but at least two. And we also, another point I want to make is, when we measure your interest, I recommend that people have at least two different measures of interest so that you can see that you are scoring in the same way on both, or that you're not. And if you're not, then there's a question about, well, what's the best measure of your interest? In the case of interest, you can, anybody, anywhere that has computer access can take the ONET interest profiler. I strongly recommend you do that if you haven't already. You also can buy at a relatively inexpensive rate the self-directed search, which was developed by John Holland to simulate a career assessment experience. That's published by the PAR publishing company. So there you could get, even if you're doing it yourself, you could get a couple of goes at it. And if they're discrepant, so for example, if you're artistic and realistic in interest, that's going to be a harder combo to put together than if you're artistic and, say, investigative, or artistic and say social. A lot of therapists, for example, have both social and artistic interests. So hopefully your interests are moving in the same direction, but if they're not, then you can look for other avenues to express what is not going to be expressed in your day-to-day work. For example, I've worked over the years with many creatively talented people, and many of them are just not going to be able to make a living at it, if by making a living that means having enough money for food and rent or a house. And so oftentimes they end up in other occupations for their quote-unquote day job, but they need to find an outlet oftentimes, because that artistic interest, that music talent or whatever, doesn't just go away. It's still there and often begging for expression. And sometimes people have to be creative and innovative in how they do that. I do also want to say, I don't know that that was a question directly, but when we talk about introverts versus extroverts and conscientious, high versus low, as psychologists, we're often looking at the extremes, but a lot of folks on these dimensions are in between. You know, there are a lot of folks, sometimes called ambiverts, who are both have introverted and extroverted characteristics. They're not so strong on either one. And we want to be careful not to think that all of us have to fit in one category or another. Oftentimes, if you're in between, then you have the advantage of having natural affinity for multiple kinds of roles or ways of relating to people. Other questions?
Okay, it looks like Iara, you were asking for the website to be put in the chat. I believe you just mentioned a website there at the end of talking about the personality assessments, Dr. Lohman?
Yeah, I have one on the slides, and this will be up when it's available to access. Okay. But it's onetonline.org. ONET online.org is the ONET site. It is a huge compendium of data where you can find out all kinds of things, not just about interests that fit with careers, but also about abilities and likely personality fits, etc. Just a real treasure trove. You can also find out about careers that are ones with great opportunities and so forth. I also mentioned the self-directed search, which was Holland's test publisher, is PAR. I don't have their web address. I don't know if it's parinc.com or something like that, but just do a search for self-directed search and you can find. And there are many others. If you have access through your universities, or through other counseling service, the strong vocational measure is widely used and has some many positive attributes as well. And there are many others out there.
Okay. Does anyone have any other questions they'd like to put in the chat? Everett was asking about psychology in other countries, particularly in Europe, and I just put information in the chat. If you visit www.psychi.org, there's information there on our international committee. You can find some more information there. You can always find a staff member on the website as well to send an email to one of us, and we'll be glad to answer any specific questions you have as well.
You can contact me at rlowman1@gmail.com if you have any questions you want to ask me directly.
Looks like Bailey Odell has a question, Dr. Lohman,
okay.
About career outlook.
Yep.
Are there any of the big 6 interests that seem like they will become more relevant or beneficial in the future?
Right. So the bright outlook occupations can be found on the on the ONET. So if you want to just look up what are the bright occupations. Now, I want to use that question to talk also about we are always trying to adapt who we are to what's out there. And so if we look at what was really important in the 1900s to sort of 1970s or so, blue-collar skills were extremely important, and there were many opportunities for folks in blue-collar areas. Now, so much of blue-collar work has been automated, and the jobs within that area have gotten to be more complex because people are using computers and other things, not just relying on their hands to get the job done. So what looks like a not bright outlook actually may be, but the skill set that is demanded tends to be rising. We do know that investigative and technical areas are expanding in their opportunities, and there are many areas in those where there is a limited supply of talent versus the opportunities that are available out there. But in every area, if you have social and conventional or artistic or whatever, there are opportunities. For example, as countries have better economies and people have more money to spend and more time to spend it, they're going to have higher needs for entertainment. So look at what's been going on with Netflix doing its own movies and with Prime Video and lots more. These open up opportunities that were otherwise not there in such supply. And so part of our job is to understand ourselves, to understand what we are looking for, what kind of career matters for us, and then match that with what is out there. And sometimes we don't get a choice because of a lot of factors that are influencing an economy at a particular point of time may be really bad and it's hard to find jobs. That's not the case right now. And then we may have to settle for something that's not an ideal fit. But the closer we can get to where we're going to use our interests, our abilities, our personality, our particular constellation of them every day in our job, the more likely we are to be satisfied over time. If we can't do that for all kinds of external reasons, then we hopefully will find outlets for those aspects of ourselves that we can't find expression for in the workplace.
Very good. Well, Dr. Lohman, we've reached the 1 hour mark. I'd like to thank you so much again for presenting today. What a wonderful topic, and you've given us great things to consider and to think about. Thank you all for attending today. Again, my name is Cynthia Wilson. I'm the Director of Membership and Development with Psychi. Feel free to email me with questions. And as Dr. Lohman mentioned, this will be put up in a few days on our website in our Learning Resources Management System. So feel free to let your friends know as well if they missed the webinar today. Thank you again, Dr. Lohman.
My pleasure. And goodbye to everybody. Thanks for coming.